Good evening. It's lovely to be back doing my first live bibliotherapy session of 2021. And what better way to start than with new beginnings in literature? So it's going to be a lovely evening full of all kinds of different new beginnings in the world of books. And I'd love to know any of your favourite new beginnings in literature. Are you lovers of science fiction, maybe when people go to new planets and start afresh? Or are you more the kind of reader who loves literature about nature, farming, starting afresh in the world of the land, getting your fingers into the soil? Or perhaps do you love new beginnings which are children's stories like the classic Secret Garden that so many of us love? I'm going to start off with what I feel seems a brilliantly appropriate new beginning, which is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written at the end of the 14th century, all about a group of pilgrims going off on a journey, telling stories to each other. And I'm going to start by reading you the prologue in the original Chaucerian English, which will probably sound quite hilarious, and do forgive me for my weird accent. Here beginneth the book of the Tales of Canterbury. When that April with his showers suit the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the fleur. When Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender cropes and the younger son, hath in the ram his half course iron, and smaller fowls maken melody, that sleepen all the night with open ye. So pricketh him nature in her courages, then longen folk to goon on pilgrimages. And palmers for to seeken stronders, to fern a halways, knoweth in the sundry Londers, and specially from every shire's end of England, to Canterbury they wend. The holy blissful martyr for to seek, that him hath holpen when that they were seek. Before that in that season on a day, in Southwark at the Tabard, as I lay, ready to wenden on my pilgrimage, to Canterbury with full devout courage, at night was come into that hostelry, well 29 in a company of sundry folk, by aventure y fall in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury wouldden ride. This is my very ancient copy of the Canterbury Tales, which I hate to admit I've had for 30 years. And that's why it is actually falling apart. There's bits of it coming apart in my lap as we speak. But I must say it's still a fantastic read, and I would very much recommend it as a read right now, because it is all about storytelling, and all these different pilgrims get a chance to tell their tales. Thanks, Damien, for reminding me that my Oxbridge education was not wasted. I'm so glad that I did get to read Chaucer, I have to say, and Gawain and the Green Knight, also amazing medieval poetry. So I would say if you can read the original, then do. You would really enjoy it, and you can get copies where you have the translation of the original next to the original, which does really help, I have to say. And it's really fun to try and read both of them together, the original and a newer version, because you see the fun that Chaucer has with his language. I know a lot of people might find Chaucer difficult to read now, and perhaps sometime I'm going to have to do a whole session on him because he is so brilliant. But tonight he's just one of the many great new beginnings I've got in literature. But he is very witty, he's very funny, and he does tell all kinds of excellent stories, from the story of the knight who's very valorous and full of noble deeds, to the reed and the miller who tell their tales, which are very, very saucy, very risque, and positively quite shocking at times. So they're incredibly entertaining. And Peter Ackroyd, that excellent writer who I'm sure many of you will know for his other brilliant books, such as his book about the London Underground, his book about London, and his biographies of Blake and many more, Dickens and so on, has also written his own version of the Canterbury Tales. It doesn't have the full 24 tales which Chaucer told himself, but it does tackle the key tales such as the Reed's Tale, the Knight's Tale, and many more. It's also illustrated, which is rather nice too. And I'm going to read you a bit of his version of that general prologue so that you can see how Ackroyd tackles the joy of Chaucer and brings it into a modern parlance, which is much easier to read, let's face it. But I do think he does it brilliantly because he does it in a way which very much nods to what Chaucer's talking about. He very much gets into the colloquial phrases and the very different voices which are found in Chaucer. And that's what's so brilliant about Chaucer too. He's not only brilliant at doing the very highfalutin language of the knight in the Knight's Tale, he's also brilliant at doing the far coarser language of the reeve and the miller. But here's his general prologue, which is the bit that I just read to you in the original. When the soft, sweet showers of April reach the roots of all things, refreshing the parched earth, nourishing every sapling and every seedling, then humankind rises up in joy and expectation. The west wind blows away the stench of the city, and the crops flourish in the fields beyond the walls. After the waste of winter, it is delightful to hear birdsong once more in the streets. The trees themselves are bathed in song. It is a time of renewal, of general restoration. The sun has passed midway through the sign of the ram, a good time for the sinews and the heart. This is the best season of the year for travellers. That is why good folk then long to go on pilgrimage. They journey to strange shores and cities, seeking solace among the shrines of the saints. Here in England, many make their way to Canterbury and to the tomb of the holy, blissful martyr Thomas. They come from every shire to find a cure for infirmity and care. It so happened that in April I was lodging at Southwark. I was staying at the Tabard Inn, ready to take the way to Canterbury and to venerate the saint. There arrived one evening at the inn 29 other travellers, and much to my delight, I discovered that they were all Canterbury pilgrims. They came from various places and from various walks of life, but they all had the same destination. And so it goes on. Peter Ackroyd does brilliantly take us back to the time of the 14th century when those pilgrims were going off to see, to make their pilgrimage to Canterbury. And he really does it brilliantly. Tamazin, thanks for your comment. You say, I remember reading it in the original at university before someone highlighted that there was a newer version that might help my understanding. It was not as poetic as the original, though, I have to say. So true, Tamzin, and thanks for that. I did really struggle when I first had to read it at university, and it did take me a long time to get into it. But actually, it's one of those books which really does pay to get through the pain barrier. And if you can listen to it, that also really helps because you will get swept away with the language. Chaucer uses alliteration brilliantly. He is so playful, full of puns, and all in all, it's a great read. Or you could read it to someone else if you've got a very long-suffering housemate that would be willing to listen. And I bet you would actually have a huge laugh if you did so. For people unfamiliar with it, I'll just give a little bit of background before we move on to more modern texts. But I would also love to say that particular passage, which is all about the spring, is one that really brings joy to my heart. And it is what we need. We need to be thinking about spring, new shoots pushing up. And I do love that idea of this is the time that we need to get travelling. Obviously, we can't at the moment, but it's lovely to do it vicariously through those pilgrims. So the framing device for the stories is a pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, Kent. There are 30 pilgrims who undertake the journey together at the Tabard Inn in Southwark. And Harry Bailey is the host of the Tabard. He serves as master of ceremonies. Most of the pilgrims at the beginning of the book are introduced with little short intros by Chaucer, and he gives you a flavour of what they're like the wife of Bath, who is a formidable woman, and it's definitely worth reading her tale, which is very bawdy. The knight, who is very much caught up in his worries and concerns to do with the court, and the many more pilgrims. In fact, Chaucer had even bigger ambitions for this work than he managed to write. He was going to do a story for each of the pilgrims on the way to Canterbury and another story for the way back, but it actually was all too much, and he already wrote 17,000 lines of poetry, which is pretty amazing. So he had great aspirations. He succeeded in creating one of the most famous works of English literature, and it is still read to this day. So go on, have a look at it if you never have. So that's a nice way of bringing us into the start of this idea of new beginnings in literature, which is all about nature, spring, and going on journeys. There's a lovely book which I'd like to talk about a little bit here, which is very much in the vein of nature writing. A Wood of One's Own by Ruth Pavey is a really gorgeous book, which really does make you want to stretch those sinews and get out into the world of nature. Ruth Pavey is a garden journalist who lives in London, or used to, and she spent many, many years and months fantasizing about having her own piece of woods in the countryside. And over the years, while she was living in Hampstead, London, she used to go and visit the Somerset Levels, I think because she'd had a brief connection with them in her childhood, but nothing more than that. And she soon began to start fantasizing about growing her own piece of woodland, buying a piece of woodland and then working in that woods to make it something beautiful and a place of her own, which is what she did. So this book takes us through the process of her fantasizing about wanting to buy the piece of wood, then finding one after going through many different possibilities, finding the perfect place, trying to buy it at auction, realizing she didn't have enough money, and finally finding what was the perfect place. And then it's about how she works on the woods over many years and eventually even buys her own house down in Somerset near the woods so that she can be near it. And it's a really lovely, uplifting, positive piece of writing, full of reflections and literary moments when she's talking about the books that she read while she was working on the book. She also has a degree in art and she does lovely illustrations for the book. So all in all, it's an absolute delight to read. And I'm going to read you one of her sections where she's talking about poetry and how she brings poetry into her experience of looking after woodlands. So this is chapter 6, titled Weeds, Flowers and the Opening Up of Long Hill Orchard. And she starts with a quote from a poet called Walafrid Strabo, translated from the Latin by Rafe Payne. So we're starting off with the very ancient poetry with a bit of Chaucer and a bit of Latin, and we will be moving on to some modern texts soon. This is the translation. But this little patch which lies facing east was full of nettles. All over my small piece of land they grew, their barbs tipped with a smear of tingling poison. What should I do? So thick were the ranks that grew from the tangle of roots below. They were like the green hurdles a stableman skilfully weaves of pliant osiers when the horse's hooves rot in the standing puddles and go as soft as fungus. So I put it off no longer. I set to work with my mattock and dug the sluggish ground from their embraces. I tore those nettles, though they grew and grew again. I destroyed the tunnels of the moles that haunt dark places, and back to the realms of light I summoned the worms. That was written in 840 AD. So Ruth Pavey is now explaining that poem and why it's important to her, and I feel it's a really lovely moment of the book which very much brings alive her experience of working in this unique piece of woodland in the Somerset Levels. There you are, well aware of which century it is, when suddenly someone from another time or place is there too, keeping you company. To me, that is one of the great joys of reading. I first became a nettle owner more than 11 centuries after Walafrid Strabo had confronted his, but as my nettles grew and grew again, he stood, as it were, on my shoulder. Walafrid, poet, monk, one-time tutor to Charlemagne's great-nephew, returned from his employment out in the great world to the Benedictine abbey of his childhood, Reichenau, to become its abbot. In his poem about nettles and gourds, irises and wormwood, roses and betony, he speaks as a practical grower and herbalist, which is unusual, personal records of early gardeners being rare. Walafrid died in 849, the same year that Alfred the Great was born. I would like to spin a web to link the two, to have Alfred reading Walafrid's poem or placing it in the library of his new abbey at Athelney. I could project an even more improbable web to include Suggs' orchard, but I will keep to the nettles. Whether in the first or third millennium, there's nothing like a nettle to bring you down to earth. I won't go on because this is the kind of book that you can read continually and find wonderful moments of excitement and description if you are a gardening lover, or even if you're not and you simply enjoy fantasizing about other people's gardens, which is really more where I am in life, or their pieces of wild woods. It's a really lovely read, and I would hugely recommend it as a read to dive into, disappear into, and visit that gorgeous woods in Somerset as a mental staycation, and admire all her lovely pictures too. And I do believe that she's actually writing a sequel now. So successful has been this book. There are a couple of other great nature-related books that I'm going to be talking about tonight, one of which is another of my favourite New Beginnings reads, which is A Place Called Winter, written by Patrick Gale. It was written in 2015, but it's all about winter in Saskatchewan, Canada in 1908. Well, actually, when I say it's about winter, it is about a place literally called Winter, because the pieces of land that people moved to in order to colonize were given names which were alphabetically decided from A to Z. And the place which the hero of Patrick's book is given to live in is called Winter because it came after V and before Y. So it's called Winter even though this is not actually winter when the action happens, though it's a book with amazing descriptions of the soil, getting your fingers into the soil, creating farmland and building something terrifyingly and completely from scratch. It's a really great, fascinating, multi-layered novel, and it's all about this character, Harry Kane, who's loosely based on Patrick Gale's own grandfather, who did indeed emigrate to Saskatchewan in 1908. And it's all a little bit murky and misty as to why he moved there. But in Patrick's version of the story, it's because he was gay and he was actually married and had a child, but was revealed and discovered to be gay and realised that he couldn't carry on living in London and decided, almost on a whim, to go and take up this offer to emigrate to Canada to try and build new land and to work the farmland in Canada, which is what he did. But it's a great adventure with many very interesting sidetracks, because the character Harry, we first see him getting married and having quite a nice life being married before he realises that he is gay and that he can't stay true to his marriage, and indeed that he's been discovered, so he's got to leave. And when he goes off to Canada, he is followed by this terrifying man, Truls Munch, who's one of the most scary men in literature, who really attacks Harry in quite terrifying ways that I won't go into. But Harry does find love when he gets to his wonderful piece of land in the end, even though it is a piece of land which is bleak and needs huge amounts of back-breaking work. He finds a way of living on it, starting off in a bell tent, living through the freezing Canadian winter in a bell tent, which sounds horrific, and then having to slowly work his way into the land. And he's also at one point put into a mental hospital because of his homosexuality. So we do have some very interesting revelations about what did really happen if you were gay in that time in 1910 in Canada. And it's horrific to see the treatment of what happens to Harry Kane, but he gets through it. And all in all, it's a really fantastic and uplifting book, which is very much one about new beginnings. So that's one of the themes of the new beginning idea, which is all about nature. But we can also go in other different directions in new beginnings. And I know that lots of you will have many comments about what you think are the best books about new beginnings. But this is one which very much sprung to mind when I was thinking about the theme. Obviously, it has a title which is very much about new beginnings, but it is a very mysterious book which is full of strange, wonderful happenings. So it's by Penelope Fitzgerald, who is an author that is much revered, and she's one of those authors that once you discover, you tend to fall in love with and want to read everything that she's read. This book was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1988, which is when it came out. And it's set in Moscow in 1913. And it tells a very odd story about a man living in Moscow who has been running a printing shop there. And at the very start of the book, his wife walks out on him with their 3 children, leaves a note saying that she's gone, but with no explanation at all. So it's a kind of new beginning in the sense of being abandoned. And I have got a few books like that up my sleeve tonight. The new beginnings which are thrust upon us rather than chosen, which are a very common trope in literature. And in this book, Frank Reed, once abandoned by his wife, takes it all quite well, even though he is really sad to lose his children. But within about 3 pages, the children are back because their mother couldn't cope with them having been used to a nanny looking after them. So back they come. And then the story tells us all about how Frank copes over the next few months without his wife, and how he ends up falling in love with a woman that helps with his children. We intermittently hear about the wife who's disappeared back to England. And it's a very strange, mysterious book, but it is a lovely one to read right now, I think, because of its unusual setting, being set in Moscow. It's beautifully described. It's full of odd nuances and ideas that linger with you It's one of those books that you keep thinking back to and thinking, what exactly was that all about? And it does also have some slightly intriguing, strange spiritual moments, which I'm just going to read you a little bit of so you get the idea of the oddities and quirks of Penelope Fitzgerald. I do think in a way she's a bit like Iris Murdoch in some of the things that she touches on and the way that she goes into slightly spiritual interludes in the books. So in this moment, the family, Frank and his children, have all gone off to stay in their country house, which is outside Moscow, to have a bit of time out, which is what we would probably all love to be doing. If only we all had country houses that we could be hiding in. Not that we obviously are going anywhere. So it's great to do it through Penelope Fitzgerald. And it's the middle of the night. The daughter, who's probably about 8, has woken up and she's wondering what's going on. You couldn't say it was pitch dark. The moon in the cloudy night sky moved among the moving branches. Dolly could see at first, if she looked back, the light in the Dakar front window, which was left burning all night. Sorry, I should have said she's gone on a walk with the nanny in the middle of the night. Then, although the path seemed to run quite straight, the light disappeared. The Dakar, where Ben and Anushka lay strewn and sleeping, divided her from sleep, was left behind. At the point where another track crossed their own, Lisa stood still and looked around. Dolly, you're limping. I'm all right. I can't go back with you now. I'm all right. Dolly was no longer thinking either of herself or of anything else, being concerned only with struggling painfully alone through the plunging half-darkness. The leaf scent pressed in on her. There was nothing else to breathe. They had turned to the left and walked perhaps almost as far as they'd come along the first path from the Dakar. Then Dolly began to see on each side of her, among the thronging stems of birch trees, what looked like human hands, moving to touch each other across the whiteness and blackness. Lisa, she called out, I can see hands. Lisa stood still again. They were in a clearing into which the moon shone. Dolly saw that by every birch tree close against the trunk stood a man or a woman. They stood separately, pressing themselves each to their own tree. Then they turned their faces towards Lisa, patches of white against the whitish bark. Dolly saw now that there were many more of them, deep into the thickness of the wood. That is a very odd scene with all these strange people in the middle of the woods in the middle of the night. And it's, to be honest, never really explained. It remains enigmatic. But still, it's a really fascinating, great and enjoyable read. And it also ends on a positive note, which I think is possibly something which lots of people might want right now at this time when we all need positivity. And that's why I'm not really focusing on dystopian novels such as Station 11, even though I think it's a brilliant book and it does have new beginnings and new hope. But it is very much a grim novel about the after effects of a pandemic, and I feel that maybe we don't want to dwell on that right now. However, another fantastic book about new beginnings, which I've recently very much enjoyed, and which also has themes of both nature and having a new beginning thrust upon you unexpectedly, as in this book, is The Great Alone by Kristin Hannah, which came out in 2017, which is a great gripping read set in Alaska. And it's all about a girl, Lenny, 13-year-old, whose father, Ernst Albright, is a former prisoner of war, having had some terrible experiences in his military life. And he has become a changed and volatile man. And this book is all about how the family decide to start afresh because they can't really cope with their life in Seattle because Ernst Albright, the dad, keeps losing his job and going a bit crazy, being too volatile. And he's offered a house in Alaska where they can live for free. So the family move up there together and start anew living in this hut where they have to survive the Alaskan winter where temperatures go down to minus 30 degrees. It's a wonderfully beautiful place. They live near the sea and they feel very much part of a community. And at first, everything seems very positive and they're welcomed into the community. Ernst Albright seems to be doing very well and putting his past behind him. But then the nights grow longer. We end up having only 4 hours of daylight every day. And Ernst Albright's temper rises and he goes back to his formerly bad behaviour and starts hitting his wife. It's quite a traumatic book at times, but it's very much one where you feel like the key characters are going to survive and the right people are going to win through. And it is a very much a roller coaster of a read. I was completely swept away and swept along by the read. I found it very much a therapeutic experience. And it also is really beautiful and inspiring about Alaska itself. So it's a book that does make you want to go and explore Alaska, though not necessarily go and live in it through the harshest winters and do your own fishing and make sure that you don't fall through the ice. There's a lot of terrible facts and figures throughout the book because I think it is very much based on true experience about how I think 5 people in 1,000 go missing in Alaska every year and nobody knows why. It could be a bear, it could be that they fell through the ice, or it could just be that they froze to death. However, this book is not by any means one that dwells on those negatives. It's also one that is very much full of light and life and positivity. So I think it's a great book to read about new beginnings, which kind of takes you through the ringer, but also brings you out the other side. Now, when I was tweeting about this subject of new beginnings in literature, I got quite a lot of people mentioning sci-fi, and there are some fantastic books in the world of sci-fi where people start afresh and in a way human civilization itself starts anew. It's a very common trope in sci-fi. One of my personal favourites is the Chaos Walking trilogy by Patrick Ness, which is all about humanity having to start a new colony on another planet. And on that planet, there's a strange virus, which means that everyone can hear other people's thoughts, which is quite a horrific idea. And they can hear not only each other's thoughts, but also the thoughts of animals, so the thoughts of dogs, horses, and other beings. And it is a young adult collection, but a great read for anyone. There's another great sci-fi book, though I wouldn't necessarily call it sci-fi. It's actually more of a dystopian fiction book before we get onto the sci-fi, which is Perfect Little World by Kevin Wilson, which is a really great novel all about a kind of idealized community. Is it a cult or is it a perfect community in which Dr. Preston Grind, who is the kind of cult leader figure of this community, wants to create a world called the Infinite Family, and he recruits various young women, you can see where this is going, who bring their babies, and the whole village looks after the babies. Nobody knows whose baby is whose. They're meant to all reap the rewards of having many parents. But of course, things start to go wrong in this utopian, idealized, funded community as various people begin to have different wants within that community. But it is a really good read, and it's very much one that's focusing on the idea of new beginnings and where you can take them. Anyone that's ever fantasized about living in a commune could be slightly put off by this book, but it is a fun read. Another excellent sci-fi novel that everyone should read is Dawn by Octavia Butler, which I've recently discovered is not easy to get hold of, but you should be able to get it from your local library when they're open again, or hunt it down on the world of secondhand bookshops on the internet. So this is a brilliant book, also written in the 80s, which has been hugely influential on the world of dystopian fiction. It's all about our world having been devastated by nuclear war. Humanity is on the edge of destruction, and aliens have finally made contact. These aliens rescue those humans that they can and keep most of the survivors in suspended animation, then begin the slow process of rehabilitating the planet. Now, the great thing about this book, which is different to many such science fiction novels, is the relationship with the aliens and the humans. And it's a book which very much questions ideas about race, gender, identity, and humanity itself. And Octavia Butler is an amazing writer who has been maybe a bit neglected, so you should definitely pick up her book. But the heroine, Lilith Iapo, is awakened to discover that she's been chosen to revive her fellow humans in small groups by first preparing them to meet the aliens, who are utterly terrifying jellyfish-like creatures with tentacles, and she is completely repulsed by them, and soon realizes that the idea for the aliens rescuing of humanity is for them to actually mate with humans and share their genetic makeup, which is a completely hideous idea to Lilith, and she is hugely against it at first, but then she slowly realizes that it's the only way that humanity is going to survive. And many people have commented about these books, because it is a trilogy, that we end up actually siding with the aliens because they're the ones that really are far more intelligent, wise, and philosophical than us. But the other interesting thing about it is that there are three sexes. There are males, females, and a kind of sexless third party. And they also mate by using their brains. So it's much more of a cerebral kind of mating than other forms of conception. And it is all about sharing their genetic makeup. So those are fantastic reads and really interesting new beginnings if you're feeling of a kind of dystopian nature. Another one that I'd love to mention, which is a very different type of new beginnings to the ones that we've been talking about so far, is A Nutshell by Ian McEwan, written in 2016, which is, in a strange way, it's one of the first books that came to mind for me when I was thinking about new beginnings. I suppose because it is a book that all takes place inside the womb. It's Ian McEwan's retelling of Hamlet, and it's a brilliantly clever, funny, wicked idea, because the whole book is narrated by the fetus, who is also Hamlet, who is bounded in a nutshell. Now, Ian McEwan does make quite a lot of nods to Shakespeare, but they're done in a very wry way, and you don't have to know Hamlet really well at all to appreciate the book. You only need to know the bare bones of the story, which are that Hamlet's father is murdered by Hamlet's uncle, Claudius. And this is exactly what we realise is happening around Hamlet the fetus. It's kind of a weirdly hilarious book to read, because Hamlet the fetus has the voice of an adult. He has the voice of a grown-up male narrator who sounds very much like Ian McEwan himself. But he talks about things like types of wine that he likes when his mother, Trudy, takes a sip of a fine claret. He always has something to say about it. So it does have slightly strange aspects which make you think, hang on, this is a bit weird. How can a fetus know about different types of wine? But he's obviously a ridiculously intelligent fetus, and you step back from the concept and accept it. And I, for one, found it incredibly funny. And I think it is a book which does very rapidly get under your skin and very rapidly become something that you can cope with reading, even though it's an absurd idea, because it's all being narrated by a baby inside the womb. But what makes it great and actually quite a gripping read is the fact that Hamlet knows that his uncle Claude, in this case, is going to murder his father, whose name is John, and he hears his mother and his uncle conspiring against John, and they're talking about how they're going to murder him. And you know it's going to happen, but even though you know it's going to happen, it is so well written that you are still hoping it won't. And you're also with Hamlet the fetus, hoping that he is not going to be left as an orphan. But it really is a very funny, very irreverent, very bizarre read. And it's all about new beginnings in the sense that it is a human fetus about to be born. But really, it's more just about being human. And it is a book that really enjoys the Shakespearean overtones, but it's also one that I feel is just a really great, wise and witty, hilarious read. So I'd very much recommend that. Another one that I really love, of a very different ilk, which is a different kind of new beginning, the type that's thrust upon you, is After You by Jojo Moyes, which is the sequel to Me Before You. And it's a lovely, great book, like all of Jojo's books. It's a really good read. And for people that read Me Before You and spent hours sobbing into their pillows and openly weeping on the tube or on the train, like so many of us here, it's actually really lovely to go back to the story of Lou Clark, who has lost her great love, Will Traynor, who was, for people that don't know the story, so deeply disabled that he decided in the end to voluntarily take his own life. And Lou Clark is left devastated at the end of Me Before You, and she then picks up her life in this book. And one of the things I love about it, and the reason I think it's a great read right now, is because it's set at the beginning in an airport bar. And wouldn't we all like to be working in an airport bar? Even just working there, even if we can't actually get on an aeroplane, the idea of being in an airport is suddenly really attractive. Maybe not to everyone, but that's how I feel. And it takes Lou onto new adventures. She meets Will Traynor's daughter, who never knew that he existed, and she basically picks up her life. And I would highly recommend that as a lovely read to sink into on a reading chair. Another one which I've been dying to mention, which really goes back to the idea of the natural surroundings in new beginnings. So it's a book that would go with A Wood of One's Own remarkably well, is by the writer Jean Giono, who many of you will be familiar with for the book The Man Who Planted Trees, which is Jean Giono's best-selling novel, which has sold millions of copies around the world and is a really beautiful novel in itself. It's one which I very frequently recommend to people as bibliotherapy clients, because that book is all about new beginnings as well. It's about a man who comes back from the war and decides to plant his valley full of trees. That's it in a nutshell. But it is a very beautifully told, lovely story. Unlike this book, it's decorated with woodcuts, which make it a very beautiful experience to read and a treasure to keep. And I think many of Jean Giono's books were decorated with these lovely woodcuts. It was originally written in French and has been translated for us by Henri Flucher and Geoffrey Myers. And this book, Second Harvest, is all about a man who gets a second chance in life and begins again in his own village, which is a village that's actually been completely abandoned by everyone else. So it was actually written in 1930, and the narrative takes place in an almost completely abandoned village where there are only 3 people left living in it, one of whom is our hero. He's called Panturle, and it's a Provençal village, which is obviously really beautiful, called Aubignan, which is, it sounds like a rather depressing place to live. All the houses are falling down, it's very dilapidated, and Aubignan is living on the land and on what he can get together in terms of any animals that he can shoot and so on. So he is living in extreme poverty, and it's all really rather dire at the beginning of the book when we meet him. But he then meets a woman and gets his second chance, and it becomes a really lovely, fantastic, uplifting read. So I'm going to read you a little bit of it from the middle of the book, which is actually when he meets the woman who is going to change his life. And I think you'll understand from this bit that I'm reading that it's a book that you are going to want to pick up almost immediately, and you won't be able to put it down. It's also joyously quite short. He spat to free his mouth of that taste of gravel and water. She approached on her knees in the grass, right up to Panturle. I'll come nearer so as not to wake him up. Yes, it's me too who pulled you out. It happened just as we were coming out of the wood. We had the waterfall right in front of our eyes and we were looking at it. Then we saw a big branch fall and then something like a bundle of linen. He said, they've let the washing drop. I said, washing? Why, it's a man. He said, a man? Not likely. I saw what had happened right away. I said to him again, it's a man. That was just when you were being swept down by the great fall, and we saw you quite well, stretched out to your full length on the falling water. Then we ran to your help. You were darting along, all stiff under the water, like a big fish, and the current swept you to the bank. He and I pulled you out onto the grass. You vomited water right away, and he said to me, he's not dead. He'll come round. We waited for a while. You didn't come round. Then he said, as it's now dark, it's all the same to us if we sleep here or elsewhere. Only we must move away a bit from the waterfall, for here it's as wet as if it were raining. And so we came as far as here. We dragged you along in the grass because you're heavy and he's an old man, and I, as you see, I'm only a woman. Look, you can still see the traces in the grass. It was true. In the meadow there was still a wide track of flattened grass. Panturle lay at the end of it like a wagon at the end of its track. Did it give you much trouble? He asked. Yes, of course, you're heavy. You are heavy, but we pulled you along by the arms. Your legs trailed behind. Then we lighted a fire. Do you smell it? He could smell burnt thyme and oak stump. We tried to dry you. Then you began to breathe again, and he said, leave him now, we'll go to sleep. He fell asleep at once, but I was unable to, and I came to see how you were getting on. Then you moved. That's all. After a while, he felt uneasy, lying at full length in front of that woman. He tried to get up. His shoulder hurt him, then his hip. But he soon realised it was nothing serious, and he managed to sit up. Ah, that's better, he said. The woman was somewhat smaller than he. He lowered his head to look at her, and in reply,
She raised her pointed face. When she did that, the moon shone fully on her. She asked, "Well then, whoever you are you from these parts or from a long way off, like us?" "I come from here," Pantel said. "This place, where we are now?" "Not quite, a bit to the left." "From that place over there," he said after a time, when he'd recognised the black mass of the hill. "There, from Aubignan." "From Aubignan? I wouldn't have guessed it. There's no longer anybody there." "There is. There's me. And you were in front of my house." "Ah, the house with the blood." She recoiled towards the grass and the shadow of the grass, her hands clutched at her knees. She murmured, "There was blood on the doorstep. We thought some evil had occurred and we ran away." A great gust of wind, full of the smell of hawthorn, passed over the silence. "I was flaying a fox," Pantel said. "Ah, that is why." "Yes. When one lives alone," he said after a while, "one is wicked or one turns so. I was not like that before. I must have got like it since I've been alone, and it's partly because of the weather. This hot weather has a curious effect on me. I'm not like that usually." She looked at him. "No, you don't seem to be like that." Pantel was shaken by a long shiver. "You're cold?" "No, but all this wet stuff's taking my warmth away." He still had something to say. He hesitated for a little while. Then it seemed to him quite simple and all right, so he added, "I'll strip. It'll be better." And she said, "Yes, you'd better. Then you mustn't catch cold." He peeled off his coat and shirt as if they were skin, and he sat there, naked under his hair. I won't read it all, but you can probably see where that is going. And I found it a book that once picked up I couldn't put down. Colleen, you're asking which do I decide to read first. They also sound so interesting. I have to agree, they're all brilliant books, and I know I would not know where to start myself. I guess you'll just have to see which one appeals to you the most. I will be posting them on Instagram and Facebook so that you can make your choices more easily and remember which books I've been talking about tonight. And I'd love to say thank you all very much for giving your suggestions, by the way, on Twitter and by email. People were sending in some really excellent suggestions and ideas, not all of which I've been able to mention. Do also have a look on our Damien Barr Literary Salon bookshop, where we've listed many of the books. So you'll be able to find them there, and you can also purchase them through there. And I will be moving on next week with my live bibliotherapy session on my Ella Beartooth Facebook and Instagram. I'm going to be talking about parties, which is something that we're all missing. Parties in literature, that is, not just parties generally. And my next salon in a month's time on the Damien Barr Facebook page here tonight and on Instagram is all about romance and love. That's because it will be very close to Valentine's Day, and February could be the month of love for us all. So do join me for that here on Damien's Facebook page. That's on the 17th of February. And also, don't forget that Damien has just released tickets for the Salon Live, which is on Thursday the 18th of February, so the day after my next session of bibliotherapy. So Thursday the 18th is going to be a fantastic Salon Live online. You can buy tickets for it at theliterarysalon.co.uk, and it's starring Russell T Davies and Ruth Coker Burks, which is going to be a really superb evening. And I would very much recommend getting those tickets now. And also, tomorrow night, there's a chance to see the fabulous Alexandra Hemmensley doing an Instagram live with Damien at 8 p.m. That's Thursday, the 14th of January, 8 p.m. UK time. celebrating the launch of her wonderful book, Somebody to Love. And I will definitely be joining that tomorrow night. So do have a look on the Facebook page and on literarysalon.co.uk for all those events and more. And also come to my Facebook page next week. I'll be continuing to do Bibliotherapy Live once a week, and I'll be here once a month on Damien's page. So do send me any bibliotherapy ailments, any questions about books, any thoughts about what books to read, about what times in your life. I'm always here to answer questions, and I'd love to hear any of your ailments. So feel free to send me an email. That's to ella@ellabertu.com, or tweet me or send me a message on Instagram. And thank you so much for joining me tonight for this session on New Beginnings. I will see you soon. Good night. Just turning